Hello, and welcome to episode 26 of the Intern's Oddities. Today, we'll be starting part 1 about the American Revolution. This is a mini series that I will be doing about different revolutionary wars throughout history. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, 1775 was the beginning of the American Revolution when the North American colonists were thrust into war from Lexington to Yorktown. So, you could say it was a fairly big war, you know. It's a lot of land to cover. The American Revolution would eventually lead to the creation of what we now know as America. The actual sparks for this conflict were set over 150 years previously as the Europeans began colonizing the Americas, settling in places like Jamestown and Quebec. The British colonists are the ones who introduced us to democratic traditions and fundamental rights they had won over hundreds of years of warfare and rebellion. Long story short, the political situation was tierce as Parliament saw their power within the government to be absolute. They were all over the place and, they were like, hey, we don't need to listen to the other branches of the government because we're pretty powerful ourselves. So what we say goes. We are the law. That's kind of the attitude they had. Now, 1756 was the start of the 7 Years' War, which is often viewed as the true start, as it was the first global pandemic conflict. Sorry, I don't know what I'm saying. First global conflict within the revolution. Sorry about that. Both sides of the war would come to rely upon their Native American allies to help them through this. So they were using uh, their allies to help them through, but I think it's interesting that they said that they were the Native American allies because, not to get too far into it, but I do like to, think out loud sometimes as I discuss these things because if I don't insert my own thoughts and opinions, then what's the point in discussing this at all, right? So I think it's interesting that we even had Native American allies in the first place, considering the Trail of Tears and, but not trying to get too deep into that. Anyways, many people in Great Britain are greatly angered by the idea of British subjects being taxed without representation in Parliament, and this is where the popular term you may have heard before, no taxation without representation, originated from. That'd be a pretty cool song, too. Someone should make a song about that. Outside of Hamilton. I listen to Hamilton a lot. I like that one. Anyways, in 1766, William Pitt, who was Britain's wartime leader during the time of the 7 Years' War, said to the House of Commons, "It is my opinion that this kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies. It cannot continue a century. If it does not drop, it must be amputated." And after several failed attempts to raise revenue in the 1760s, people across the colonies began to get more and more upset and irritated with Parliament's meddling, and as a result, there even began talks of resistance throughout the colonies. And, and we've been hearing a lot of talks like this on social media in modern times. Resistance and stuff. Like, I don't want to go too far into it, but I did see some stuff about resistances. So I'm keeping an eye on that. Anyways, riots eventually start to break out in Boston, leading to the deployment of the regular army to protect local officials. Like in the free speech episode uh, yesterday, when Rob mentioned how each colony had their own individual army back then, but how every soldier sent from the U.S. Army in modern times would be considered a federal soldier, and as a result would no longer help a nation should they secede from the United States during modern times. And then eventually tensions boiled over in the city, and an angry crowd provoked the soldiers into firing. Now, maybe it's just me, but after the J6 incident and seeing the way people were behaving when they got pardoned recently, I could easily see something like this happening in modern times as well. Like there's a lot of tension between the two opposing sides of, the parties right now. But I suppose it's always been that way. You know, people will be people, and it's I don't know why, but most people have difficulty getting along with each other and having different opinions, which that's a whole other side issue. This would eventually become known as the Boston Massacre, as the first 5 colonists lay dead in the streets. The soldiers were removed from Boston, however, the tensions remain high regardless. They're like, "Hey, sorry, our bad. We'll take the soldiers out of Boston." And the people are like, "Uh, okay, but what are you gonna do about these guys that you've already, uh, you know?" 3 years later was the Boston Tea Party, one of my favorites. I talk about this a lot. I love the Boston Tea Party, where many Boston people would dress as Native Americans to board East India Company ships and pour 9,000 pounds worth of goods into the harbor in order to protest laws that undercut the price of smuggled tea. Now, I don't really know much about tariffs, but this kind of sounds like tariffs to me. They were protesting laws that undercut the price of smuggled tea. So, would tariffs undercut the price of anything that they raised them on? I but like I said, I don't really understand tariffs. Just a thought that I had when I was researching this. So as a result of this Tea Party, the British government would soon pass what is known as the Intolerable Acts to send a message across the colonies, and these acts would essentially replace self-governing with direct British control in Massachusetts. In the city of Philadelphia, October 1774, delegates would meet as the First Continental Congress in order to discuss the united response, and those who wanted independence were known as patriots. Interesting. In Boston, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and would start training a militia for war, which caused Massachusetts to be declared as an open rebellion by the new British authorities, and the scene is set for a grand battle between Parliament and the colonies. Now, this sounds like something that was mentioned on the last episode, and this is what would happen if any state tried to secede today. As Rob and Spider mentioned on the free speech episode yesterday, well, not yesterday, sorry, my time is all weird. It's 3:47 a.m. right now, so I'm not sure if it's today or yesterday or tomorrow. Yeah, it's one of those weird times. Uh, anyways, they would just be declared as enemies and instantly reclaimed for the U.S. So, like, if someone tried to secede, like, I don't know, California, for example, or Florida, I don't geography. I'm sorry. But if someone tried to secede, then basically America, quote unquote, would just send the army over there and be like, we're just going to take over. That's kind of my understanding of what would happen. So, General Gage didn't want war and thought that he could prevent war by using his soldiers in lightning raids to capture or destroy military supplies across Massachusetts. These raids mostly helped to organize the colonial militias into what would later become known as the Minutemen, as they could be ready to respond to a fight within a minute's notice. You can do a lot more research on this by playing Fallout 4 and talking to Preston Garvey. What's that? Oh, by the way, there's a settlement that needs your help. Here, I'll mark it on your map. I couldn't resist when they mentioned the Minutemen. I had to talk about Preston Garvey. If you've played Fallout 4, then you know, and I'm so sorry about that person. All this stuff happening would eventually lead to the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. The land route to Concord is closely watched by rebel sympathizers during the day, so Smith's forces would row across the bay in the early hours of April 19th, trying to maintain the element of surprise, and each soldier is even carrying limited ammo to try and help make them faster, which will prove to be a big mistake later that day. They lose the element of surprise as forces start to gather in Lexington, and Smith sends word back to Boston asking for reinforcements. So, stuff's getting kind of serious now. They need to be careful. Parker tells his men, stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, then let it begin here. 100 local spectators watch curiously as the two armies casually hurl insults at each other until eventually the militiamen begin to leave and a resounding shot rings out. And in the immediate confusion, other shots start to be fired from both sides until the British company fires volley shots without orders. So we don't know who started the war, but that shot was what started it. Like, really started it and broke out because it was already building up, but that really started that particular battle. Now, nobody realized it at the time, but the first blood had already been shed of the Revolution as 8 militiamen lay dead on Lexington Common. That's what I was talking about when I said that was the start of the war. But the problem is, well, I don't know if it's really a problem, but the thing is, we don't know if it was their side or our side because we just heard a shot, and by the time anyone was looking, it was already too late. So, on arrival on Concord, the British search buildings where resident. Sorry, let me try that again. On arrival on Concord, the British search buildings where residents give them permission and burn the small amounts of contraband, but they are unable to find any large military stalls or rebel leaders as anything of value had been dispersed hours previously. So basically, they knew they were on the way. They knew this was going to happen, so they hid all their valuables before they even got there. Smart. So keep that in mind. Always know a good hiding spot for your valuables, just in case. Just in case. I think he works for Safe Auto these days. There are over 1,000 militiamen surrounding Concord, and Smith knows it is beyond time for him to go. They were far outnumbered and far away from the safety of the Boston harbor. Just as it seems they're about to be overwhelmed, though, the British rejoice as reinforcements arrive, commanded by L. Percy, with 1,000 men strong. Nice. So reinforcements finally arrive right in the nick of time. That that sounds like a movie. That's great. I love it. This is history. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, you could, but I'm sorry. I go on tangents. This uncanny tangent over here. Although I'm pretty pale for calling it a tangent, but anyways. The militia has large forces organized and waiting at Cambridge, but Percy decides to march towards Charlestown, cautious of a trap, and as they cross over the hill, they limp back to the safety of Boston, as this marks the end of the First War of the American Revolution. So they went through all this, and they get through the war, and they tried so hard, and in the end, they just end up limping away. Thank you for coming to hang out with me. Sorry I flubbed my lines a few times, but I'm very exhausted and I just knew I had to, get this recorded. So I love you all. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for supporting me, being here for me. And as always,